They're not great, but they're better than nothing in terms of captioning. So I'm actually going to start sort of further back in my presentation before I even introduce myself. So first, in way of image description, I'm a white woman in a white angular room with a like stripy top on. And my slides are like a dark navy blue, and they'll be mostly text. I'll image describe when things come up, but the text is really, they're very text heavy because I am not very artistic. All right, so I want to start with a quote from my friend Cynthia. And Cynthia is someone I know from hanging out in the waiting room of my prosthetist's office, which is to say we are friends and we are amputees. And we have gotten long periods of time to hang out together because you sometimes have to wait a really long time when you're getting your leg fitted. Since then, we visit on and off. I know her children. I've been invited to things, but she's not a public figure. But I love this that she wrote at one point, and I asked if I could use it. She writes, newer amputees see these events unfold in the media and expect to be able to strap that leg on and go. Then the questioning of their abilities begins. Thoughts and feelings of what's wrong with me? Why can they do that and I can't? Reality is that those who were fortunate enough to lose a limb in a more dramatic, newsworthy way receive extensive services that are not within the parameters of reality. These are frequent, almost daily struggles for us normal, average amputees. We see amputees dancing away on television, running marathons, simply walking. These fortunate few are the focus of news media. The bed of roses, inspirational stories that the general public is exposed to is far from reality. Please, before you question or comment to an amputee why that person you casually run into at the grocery store or other public place isn't wearing their leg, or if they have one at all, or why they aren't doing certain activities, realize that they may be living a normal, realistic existence in a media-ridden society. All right, this is where I flip all the way to the beginning of the slides. I never quite know where I want to start, so there we are. If you don't have the Google Slides, I'm pasting them back in the chat for your interest. As a matter of accessibility. This talk is called A Cyborg Critique of AI Futures. My name is Ashley Hsu. I'm an associate professor of science, technology, and society, all three of them, at Virginia Tech. That's just the name of the department. And some of the material I'll be presenting to you today is supported by the United States National Science Foundation under award number 1750260, but my opinions do not represent the National Science Foundation. This grant allows me to work with a team of graduate students. So a lot of what I talk about today will intersect with some of the work of Joshua Earl, who works on cyborg maintenance, Hannah Hertigan, who also works on cyborg maintenance, but from a more medical vein, and Damian Williams, who works on bias in AI systems. So they're three of the students that have worked with me on some of this research. So here are a cyborg's rules for a crypt talk. Hi, it's me, I'm the cyborg in this case. Feel free to make your body comfortable. If we were in person, I would tell you to move about as you need to, get up and go to the bathroom if you need to, sit in ways that make you comfortable rather than uncomfortable, like so many of our office chairs and conference rooms actually do. Feel free to interrupt me if I'm going too fast or if you have a question. You can ask it in the chat if you don't want to voice it. This means to the other participants, if you see something in the chat, and I don't because I am projecting my screen, please voice whatever the question is in the chat so that I can hear it. Please do interrupt me. I know that your eyes are not your intention. You do not have to be on camera to listen and come to this talk. I don't, if I'm projecting something, I can't really look at your faces either. But also being looked at shouldn't be compulsory either. I will provide you with a link to my slides, and I have an image description throughout. If you cannot see things, also here's where I usually ask, are the auto captions working? And they seem to be, they have no punctuation, so that's not great, but it is what it is. So here we are. My research, I'd like to start with the cyborg Jillian Weissa and what she what Cy has to say. Cy works on distinguishing cyborgs from triborgs. Cy is a poet, and you may have read part of their common Cyborg reading before this event. Cy writes, "They like us best with bionic arms and legs. They like us deaf with hearing aids. Though they prefer cochlear implants, it would be an affront to ask the hearing to learn sign language. Instead, they wish for us to lose our language, abandon our culture, and consider ourselves cured. They like exoskeletons, which none of us use. They would never consider cyborg those of us with pacemakers or on dialysis, those kept alive by machines or made ambulatory by wheelchairs, those of us on biologics or antidepressants. They want us shiny and metallic and in their image," end of quote. This shiny and metallic and in their image, like, makes us think about science fiction in particular ways, and the sort of story about humanity that has been featured in transhumanist narratives, but also throughout a lot of science fiction that depicts the future as a future without disabled people. Or if there are disabled people, they are somehow made super through technologies, right? We think about Geordi's visor on Star Trek, giving him, the ability to see infrared in ways that some animals do, but humans don't. Of course, we never take the animals as superior in these things. It's only once we've replicated things through technology that we think they're good. There's also a story to be told from the perspective of animal studies in a critique of AI and science fiction futures here. We're often given stories from triborgs, right? People who dream of being technologized, who perhaps are technologized in some ways, but don't depend on technologies for daily living in the way some disabled people do. So when I talk about Cyborg, I follow Jillian Weisse here to be talking about technologized disabled people, to be talking about people on pacemakers, dialysis, ventilators, people who use prosthetic legs, hearing aids, all of this sort of tech. And some of the tech that's imagined in the future for us is not stuff we would actually want. And so much of it is wrapped up in our narratives about current tech, right? Current tech is infused with sort of sci-fi visions about how bodies ought to be. But rarely are disabled people asked how we would actually like our bodies to be or what we care about in terms of tech development. Often we're left out of the stories of tech development. And this speaks to sort of the larger project that I'm working on as part of this grant with my students, which is about diagnosing the problem of techno-ableism. So I need to tell you what ableism is in case if you don't know. So ableism is a bias against disabled people. And it's not simply a bias. Fiona Kumari Campbell talks about it as a trajectory of perfection, right? So this trajectory of perfection that is sort of embedded into our cultural and societal values about who belongs in a space, who counts, whose lives are worthy, who needs to be examined, who needs to be the domain of professionals, right? So I think about some of my autistic colleagues who talk about, all the non-disabled people who have written terrible things about autistic people. And right, when you hear from autistic people, they actually write in very different ways about what it is to be autistic than we see in non-disabled experts about autism, right? So often disabled people haven't been allowed to be experts about themselves. So the sort of narratives we get and the sort of ways in which we structure society are often ableist. This trajectory of perfection, of course, shapes all of our systems of value and worth. It's shaped your education, who your classmates and colleagues are, where you are located, what you've read. Ableism involves attitudes and individual bias, yes, but it goes far beyond that to infrastructure and ways about thinking about life. It's involved in immigration. The story of immigration in the United States is very much one about the development of some disability tech, by which I mean IQ tests, to bar people from particular regions from entering the United States, to make systems of values, in this case, intelligence, and we could talk about why intelligence tests are racist and terrible. That's perhaps another talk, but these sorts of once you start thinking about ableism, you start seeing it everywhere around you. And it's throughout all of our histories in different ways. And, it has to do with where we are now, like physically on the globe in many cases, about who gets to move and who doesn't, who gets to stay, who gets taken off their land and who doesn't, whose lives are valued. And often this, intersects with white supremacy in pretty significant ways. But the strand of ableism I take issue with, and I look at in my work, is about narratives about technology that emphasize the power of technology to redeem, repair, cure, or make disabled people otherwise includable in the terminology of time Tishkalsiki. In being perceived as calling out for help as a disabled body, as a disabled mind, people think about solutions for us where we might not want them, or for our management when they think we don't get to make decisions about our bodies. The AI versions of these things are scary, right? And there are dangers of being fit for AI and others in being unfit, unseen, and unanticipated. We see techno-ableism reflected in lots of media accounts of disability technology. And I think these are related to our science fiction stories about technology. Take, for example, Bill Peace's description of exoskeleton coverage. Bill Peace writes on his blog, which is called The Bad Cripple, your typical bipedal person exposed to a barrage of misleading news stories is led to believe all paralyzed people share one goal in life: walking. Please cue the soaring, inspirational music accompanied by the brave and noble young man or woman struggling to walk, surrounded by healthcare professionals and computer scientists and engineers who share the same ritualized ideal. And here, ritualized ideal is an ableist ideal. The flip side of the obsession with walking is not discussed. No one wants to talk about the gritty reality of people who cannot walk or forced to navigate. No one wants to think about the barriers to healthcare and appropriate adaptive technology. Disability must be placed in the larger societal, historical, political, and medical context. It requires new ways of looking at disability. End quote. The current literature on disability concerns over AI and its deployment, as well as the problems of being fit and the problems of being unfit for AI, are often being discussed without disabled people at the table, right? There's a lot of assumptions about what it is to be disabled, and a lot of these come from particular societal representations of disability. So some of the work that I'm doing with this team involves classifying different tropes about disability. And these are the sort of tropes that we see everywhere. And I think all of the tropes are problematic and terrible in different ways. But what it means to become disabled or be disabled in a society that only has limited ways of seeing disabled people, and often involves not seeing disabled people as full people. We are characters to support other characters in almost in any place where disability happens on screen. In science fiction, disabled characters, when they exist at all, are usually played by 95% are played by non-disabled actors. And the depictions often fall into stereotype because of what we've been taught about disability from various fiction and nonfiction, from media accounts, who gets valued, who gets interviewed, even when it's disability topics, is often non-disabled people. The slogan of the disability rights movement in the United States has been "Nothing about us without us," meaning stop talking about us without us there, right? And it speaks to the fact that we've been mischaracterized so often. And often what people take as terrible about our lives is not the same things we would take as terrible about our lives, right? So encountering ableism is terrible, right? So there are issues with being disabled, but often they are created issues, right? The fact that a wheelchair user can't get around the campus that I work at very well because it's all stairs and hills, speaks to the fact that we keep building stairs instead of ramps, not the need for exoskeletons that most people can't afford and maintain anyway. So here are these societal representations or tropes. And I think the one that gets played out the most when it comes to AI development is really moochers and fakers. So I have that highlighted here. But the 5 tropes, and I in some of my talks, I give like lots of examples of each of these. These aren't the only tropes that are out there. I think about Lynn Manning's work in talking about what it is to be a Black blind man, where everyone assumes he's going to be very good at playing the piano because he's a Black blind man. And the only category they have in their head for Black blind man is the one that Ray Charles is in, right? There's so few representations that, in fact, it's just the Ray Charles bucket if you are a Black blind man. So that doesn't make it into this representation chart, right? These are the general categories. The first is pitiable freaks. Right, and pitiable freaks, of course, call out for your attention, your need. Often they're employed when charities try to fundraise for disability-related things, right? Oh, pity these people so badly that they need your help and charity. We see this is something Autism Speaks, which some people regard as a hate group, have rightly so regarded as a hate group because they want to eliminate autistic people, and that's genocide, right? So there's the notion of pitiable freaks, right? And this can also be like in freak shows, like they are people to gawk and stare at and try to ask like medical questions, like how is your body like that? Why do you do those things? But also in terms of we need to pity these people and provide funding in the form of charity funding. The second one is moochers and fakers. And this is the one when we talk about AI development that worries me the most. Disabled people are subject to far more scrutiny than most non-disabled people. When it comes to sort of medical regimes, being certified as disabled, being allowed disability benefits, being allowed the certification you need to access the things that you need to lead a basic sort of life. These things put us into systems of scrutiny. So it can be really hard to get diagnoses for particular types of disability, but it can also mean that being disabled in public can be risky under particular conditions. If people do not believe you are disabled, the consequences can be quite severe in terms of loss of benefits, but then also just in terms of violence, being targeted because you are disabled or because people don't believe you about your disability, particularly if you are a wheelchair user who can stand up for limited periods of time. Right now, adult wheelchair users are paralyzed, surprised, despite what you've seen in the media. Lots of wheelchair users can move their legs. I know fear among some of my wheelchair using friends, like if they move their legs in public, people look at them with scrutiny and think that they are faking their disability, right? Where I see far more on the other end, where disabled people try to appear as non-disabled as possible in order to be allowed to participate in society, right? Mooching and faking is actually is a red herring in so many of these conversations. The third is bitter cripples. We're particularly bitter because of our disabilities. I think about Captain Hook. Basically, any media that has featured an arm amputee involves the bitter cripples trope. Luke Skywalker. This loss required a certain cost in terms of emotional cost. And I think you're also like, if you are an arm amputee in public, especially at least in US media, because Captain Hook is such a dominant character of these representations. And there are so few non-villainous accounts of arm amputees. So this is a particular arm amputee trope too. The assumption, like, I know arm amputees who have gone out in public and made like small children scream in fear, right? So that these tropes actually play into like how we get addressed and how we are seen in public in ways that are quite dramatic at times as well. The fourth is shameful sinners. And this is where some people talk about prosthetics as redemption, right? That people have sinned and need to bow down somehow to the power of technology. Cassandra Crawford has talked about this in The Prosthetic Impulse. But also the idea that some people deserve their disabilities gets played into this shameful sinners trope, that some people should be suffering because of either their own sin or that of their mother. So particularly narratives about autism in the 1980s featured shameful sinners, where the term refrigerator mother was supposed to be the cause of autism in children, meaning your mom wasn't kind and warm and didn't hug you enough as a child, and that's how you became autistic. The shameful sinners trope also, when people, when we talk about things like historically monstrous births, right? So birth defects often blamed on mothers. And then usually if there is acceptance of the child is supposed to be like some sort of burden that the community carries as part of this, as part of like what they deserve for the sin. The fifth is inspirational overcomers. And this is the one that gets played into science fiction so often, but also in our current media landscape. I'm afraid to dance in public as an amputee because people will take pictures of me and say like, oh, she's so brave. I danced just as poorly as I did before I lost my leg. And it's not really brave of me. Dancing is fun and nice, and everyone should do it. So it's something I think a lot of people either play into, right? Especially when children are given this narrative where they're called brave and courageous by their parents and community members all the time. That can be a lot to live up to and into. That's a lot to place on a child. And I mean, basically the problem with inspirational overcomers is that we shouldn't be forced to live our disabled lives for the inspiration of other people. We shouldn't be for other people. But how we're actually, when we talk about disability in informatics, it's often to the neglect of disabled people. So we have these sort of tropes, these sort of lurk in the background of our technological projects. They're engaged in science fiction in particular ways. Often none of these exist in science fiction because we just assume disabled people don't exist. Or if they do exist, they've been cured. But the fact is, the future is going to be more disabled than the past. Whether it's through disease. So we've recently had this coronavirus pandemic situation. It's producing a whole bunch of new disabled people. We also have climate change to contend with, where it's going to produce, through the effects of weather and natural disasters, more disabled people, more displaced people, more people with chronic health conditions. What we can expect as a society at this point is, disease is going to continue to exist. Climate change is going to make things significantly worse. And even if we fall into the science fiction world of getting off this planet, everybody who goes into space comes back disabled, even if it's temporarily, right? In fact, space isn't very good for human beings, and it messes with our bones, and everyone has osteoporosis, or the fluid in your eyes changes pressure. So all of a sudden you went up with perfect vision, because of course they only recruit pilots with perfect vision, and they all come back with not perfect vision. It's worse vision, right? So we're recruiting for perfection and then not making people, then we're disabling them in various ways. So even if we fall into the science fiction glory visions of the future, what we can expect is more body management needing to be done, more talk about how to make infrastructure inclusive as we produce disability through our spacefaring ways, right? The future is disabled like far more than I care to think about. I'm really excited about that, but that's another thing. That's liberatory. If everyone's disabled, then all of a sudden we can build better things that let people access things, as we found during the pandemic, where a whole bunch of different accommodations that people have asked for forever in terms of work from home. Chronically ill people can work from home. Finally, they've been asking for it for a long time. The sort of flexibility in work schedules, the sort of delivery modes for medicine and groceries that weren't available in the rural place where I live. I can get those at home now. And that is because enough people were afraid of disability, acquiring it, or or became disabled, temporarily through, being very sick. That's one way to be disabled as well. It allowed a whole bunch of transformation in infrastructure that was actually friendlier to disabled people. Anyway, so when we think about disability in informatics, so when I'm thinking about consumer informatics, when I'm thinking about AI, it's often to the neglect of disabled people. Often it focuses on functional impairments, right? So, oh, do you have the right flexibility in whatever joint we're looking into? Oh, can you pass these particular tests in terms of cognition, vision, hearing, etc. And it focuses on perceived individual competencies and deficiencies instead of bodies in social spaces and built environments. I've been working from home for over a year. I have not worn my hearing aids in about 6 months. I can turn up the volume on my computer. And now I'm not like itchy in my ears all the time, and I don't have like dry ears from my hearing aids. Right? I think about like just changing the social space and the built environment around myself as a form of accommodation here, but it shouldn't have been that hard to do. So we're always asking how bodies are deficient instead of how are these spaces deficient for including people, and how do we include everyone? Should be a question we ask ourselves far more often. So often work that is done on AI is covered as work in humanitarian mode when it's related to disabled people, right? We're always other people's projects. And anyone who says they work on disability technology is praised for the work, whether it's disability technology disabled people want or not. Especially when at a distance from rich user groups or context, research sometimes precedes interest, or the interest is assumed, or people imagined what a future would be like, and it didn't involve wheelchairs, right? In fact, many people love their wheelchairs and talk about them. The word that Lawrence Carter Long uses is chariot of liberation, right? It has wheels on it, it goes places. It's, that's wonderful. There's currently work on disability bias and AI. This paper by Whitaker et al. Out of the AI Now Institute, my own article in IEEE, and then Damian Williams has been doing a lot of things about disabled and marginalized perspectives. There's a lot of work that highlights racist and sexist constructions of AI, especially around facial recognition and otherwise. And some recent work has highlighted ableism specifically. These are some of the works. But the issues with AI go beyond this is the tip of the iceberg in disability-led opinions and scholarship about AI. It's really, I think it's really great the way Whitaker et al., and there's a lot of disabled people on that team, talk about how difficult it is to capture the category of disability. Right, so there are so many ways to be disabled, right? I always feel like I'm doing a recruitment event because I want to be like, oh yeah, you have a psychiatric disability. That's what that is. Hey, you're taking the depression medication. Come join us. Oh, food allergy gang, get in here. There are just so many ways to be disabled that categorizing disability is really, really, really hard, right? And a lot of people immediately look, well, physically disabled is somehow like there's a hierarchy that's set up there. That's really problematic if we want to challenge categories that collapse us into being particular ways. I think about the quote, and this is how they put it: the way in which disability resists fitting into neat arrangements points to bigger questions about how other identity categories are mistreated as essential fixed classifications in the logics of AI systems. So disability troubles how we categorize, right? There's not a one for one. And most people who are disabled have more than one disability. That's why whenever I see studies recruiting for single disabilities, I wish them the best, but the pool you're going to get of people is going to be severely limited by the fact that you only want below knee amputees with residual limbs that are 5 inches long and no other disabilities. How do you think people become disabled? The sort of acquisition process is also usually involves acquiring multiple disabilities, or at least, if you're asking someone with an amputation, like the ways people get to amputation are usually involve other disabling conditions. We need a cyborg critique of AI systems. And we need it because disabled people know how categorization messes us up in particular ways, and how tech solutions often give us more hype than help. So Damian Williams has written about this need for marginalized perspectives in AI research. And I am talking about cyborg critique here, and I mean it in two ways. First, we know about the Harawaiian sort of figure of cyborg, right? Which is about resisting essentialisms, especially ecofeminist essentialisms. The worry for Haraway in writing the Cyborg Manifesto was really to challenge ecofeminism, not to re-emphasize binaries. Just because you elevate one binary, one side of a binary that's typically been devalued, it doesn't mean that there's like, you're still working in a binary system, right? So the figure of the cyborg was supposed to like resist that. It's a, political mythology that Haraway sets up. Haraway does a bad job in that she did not recognize that disabled people already exist, and we have cyborgs existed when she was writing that, right? If we're talking about technologized disabled people as cyborgs, people who depend on technology, who are whose lives and bodies are dependent, organized, and set through technology. But to have a cyborg critique of AI is to have a critique that pushes back on the notion that we are categorizable and exportable. At least Haraway had that part right? The resisting of these sort of binary divisions and classifications. In the second way, I also consider that the lived experience of the cyborg mind helps us theorize better about this, because those of us who are technologized due to our disabilities know more about living with, depending on, and negotiating the world through technologies than non-disabled people do. We know about the danger of power outages. Our lives are at stake if we use ventilators, or we face inconvenience if we can't plug in our parts at the right times of day. Our lives are tied up with technologies in non-trivial ways. Technologized disabled people have been with and part of us for all time. Disability, of course, is not this category that is eliminable at all. So thinking about cyborg perspectives on these things is incredibly important. We've been here. We've been here for a long time and will continue to be. And our stories about disability and about technology have often not appreciated the experience of disabled people using technology. We have to learn from a past. So in my article for IEEE that I referenced, I talk about the cochlear ear implant controversy, right? That the assumption that we should implant children with cochlear implants was highly contested within the deaf community. And there's a lot of interesting perspectives from that community. Of course, not all deaf people consider themselves disabled, right? Which is also another facet of that conversation that gets ignored. Like if you don't see yourself as impaired, right? Being given a solution for what other people assume is your impairment is actually really, really insulting. And Jaypreet Verdi, who has written about hearing technologies in her book, Hearing Happiness, and is doing some other really cool projects. I got to interview her a few months ago, and it was really interesting to hear her talk about how always being seen as someone's project sort of chips away at you in particular ways. Right? When the assumption is that you are always lacking wholeness as a disabled person, what that means in terms of how you see yourself and how you see others and how you see community is very warped. A second, learn from the past, I talk about sort of autistic self-advocacy against eugenics and pity when we talk about autism. Rua Williams is doing some really wonderful work around and against autism interventions with robots that are being pursued in HCI fields in ways that really speak against seeing autistic people as fundamentally impaired, when a lot of the sort of source of misfit is not in the person themselves, but in how we think about what's normal and what we tend to value and what we see as disruptive and how we socialize. But that's all, constructed between people and not in people themselves. And then more recent work on exoskeletons. So I referred to the Bill Peace article earlier. The the reaction to exoskeletons on Twitter, or any walking, standing wheelchair, if you search the hashtag disability dongle, and this is a hashtag created by Alex Haggard and Liz Jackson of the disabled list. Disability dongles are things that non-disabled people imagine disabled people want. They get a whole bunch of press and praise, and disability Twitter is life-giving in the way it rudely mocks a lot of these technologies that made weird assumptions about what disabled people would want. I actually, one of my classes was discussing exoskeletons, and I got the best question I've ever gotten in a class. And that is, we were looking at a picture of an exoskeleton and someone said, how do you go to the bathroom in that? Right. And one thing a lot of wheelchair users would like, especially if they're paralyzed wheelchair users, is like better hoists to get on toilets. Right. So the sort of tech a number of paralyzed people are interested in is not actually exoskeletons. It's actually about getting on and off toilets. And in fact, you would have to take this exoskeleton we were looking at completely off in order to then use some other technology to get onto a toilet. Right. It was going to make the process of using the bathroom more complicated. So then the joke was, if you need to use the bathroom in an exoskeleton, you're going to use the bathroom in an exoskeleton, right? The exoskeleton is now your toilet. Hello. So sort of design like challenges that people see, they thought that the problem was a need to walk, where the problem wasn't a need to walk, but a need to do like all the sorts of, less glamorous activities we do as human beings, get on and off toilets being an important one of them. And we can see it in sort of upcoming reactions. So if we're thinking about what cyborg perspectives can tell us in terms of AI development, paying attention to things like electronic visit verification, which is something that's rolled out in a number of US states, which involves a cell phone. If you are someone who needs a personal attendant, to help you with daily living activities, then different states, because they don't really believe you're disabled and are trying to cut your hours, different states will have your care attendants like check in on a cell phone that is controlled by the state and that has GPS, so it knows where you are. And it's a sort of surveillance and incursion that most non-disabled people don't and wouldn't accept. There's also worry about like step counting for knees. So Jillian Weissa has written about how Saya is really afraid of not walking enough or walking too much, because everyone, of course, hopes to be approved for their next leg when they need an upgrade or a repair or just a replacement. And because clinics and worrisomely like insurance schemes have access to data about how many steps Saya's taken, because there's a counter in their computerized knee that feeds data that they don't have any control over, it means that if you are too athletic, you won't be approved for this device in the future. You don't need it. And if you're not athletic enough, then you should not have that device because you can't use it to its full extent. So the sort of policing, the assumption of faking and mooching that even goes into, worries users have about prosthetic knees is actually quite scary. And this happens with all sorts of medical devices that feed information back to doctors in the cloud. I think about different diabetic monitoring supplies. I think about pacemakers that, of course, can tell what your heart is doing at any given time. All these sorts of things that have now been hooked up for downloadable information present particular worries about how people will be how people can't have control over their data in ways that they could have different mechanizations like taken away from them, different disability devices that they might actually want to use. So these are the sorts of things that come up. And just to highlight, the problems of being seen are this sort of scrutinization and policing by insurance companies and health schemes when they recognize that we're disabled and try to account for that and try to, bean count the ways in which we're disabled and impaired. This is used by disability offices to revoke benefits, by workplaces to revoke accommodations. And we're even asked by strangers to explain ourselves. So our bodies and minds are scrutinized in AI systems in ways that can be really harmful. And there's always an assumption that disabled people don't deserve as much privacy as the general population. There's also a problem in being unseen. And this is mainly where efforts exist for people in AI research are right now. So we often think that getting more data is what we need to do when we point out a problem, when people are pointing to, oh, our facial recognition systems aren't very good for people of various skin tones. Oh, we need the answer for most people becomes, oh, well, we need to feed more of that information into the system. I mean, this data doesn't solve all problems when the ways in which facial recognition will be used will be terrible for wide varieties of people. People point to the traffic deaths with autonomous vehicles that will happen because they don't understand what wheelchair users and scooter users look like, right? It can identify pedestrians, but only ambulatory walking pedestrians. We can also recognize how being unseen leads to anomalous results. That means being taken out of queues, means pat downs, means more scrutiny because we don't fit in particular ways. This means attacks in time and effort beyond what most people would take as reasonable. And often AI developers let these harms happen before addressing them, just as we've seen for skin tone, right? If you guys haven't seen the HP is racist video with White Wanda and her colleague, then you should look up HP is racist. It's from 2009. So this is a well-known and established problem around skin tone. But datafication collapses our characteristics and our identities and our existence. And we need cyborg resistance to AI to make clear how technologies are made and implemented beyond the usual tech redemptive narratives for disabled people. This means including disabled people in design, but that doesn't go far enough to cripping technologies. Since being politically disabled, to use the words my friend Elizabeth McLean likes to use, engages us towards thinking about how to make tech more just, and not just how to make disabled people serve our tech regime better. We want more ways of being disabled, being fine, being everyday, and having the same as what other people get. The crib questions we get about AI and its development are about maintenance and repairability and fixing and fitting and access. These aren't questions that we're seeing arise in any sort of science fiction, often because we're erased in it. And it's not a question we're seeing in current tech development. The right to repair maybe does some of this work in those conversations, but the disability representation there is still also very poor. I mean, I think about the fact that when my leg is broken, the times it is broken, I have headed to a hardware store and laid on the floor of the hardware store, well, we found just the right bolt to fix the one thing I needed. Or another time when we glued together pieces of my prosthesis as I sat in the corner of my hardware store while I talked to my prosthetist on the phone. Like what it means to have a disabled body that you need to maintain, especially when you exist at a distance from the systems that could maintain you. My prosthetist is 4 hours away by car. These things, I'm lucky my prosthetist will take a phone call and do these things, and most don't. We need to have a conversation for any new technology that is developed and deployed for disability about our autonomy and agency with it and how we might get it repaired. It can take months for wheelchair users to get basic repairs on their devices. Now, I'm not impressed by exoskeletons. I'm not impressed by fancier wheelchairs because I already know that the system is broken from inside. And all the news stories and science fiction stories have nothing like this at all. All right, I'm ready for questions if you want them. I do have like a lot of slides and I'm on some social things. I think there's some really exciting things going on. Here's a list of terms and people who are using them. Yeah, and then I just have like quotes that I like, mainly about prosthetics, particularly arm prosthetics, because I was working on that at one point. And then just about, so here's Donna Walton. I almost risked losing it when I decided I had to walk normal again in order to attain society's ideals for physical attractiveness, right? Giving into being not normal actually is more liberating for many people, right? She says, my gimpy gait is mine, and it's very normal to me. And then here's Cynthia, who I love. So yeah, I really like a long slideshow.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I assumed I was, I will just pause the recording so that people don't feel shy.